the pilot luckily managed to make it back down to base camp, which was touch and go for him, because I mean he can't afford to just stay at Camp 2. He's got fuel levels, he's got, he's not acclimatized to that altitude, he's got limited oxygen, things like that. Manages luckily to make it down to base camp, and then we had a really hairy fly back down to Lukla, literally in the riverbed all the way down. We actually had to stop halfway, and just land the helicopter and wait for this cloud cover to go. That was eye-opening.
Welcome back to the World Extreme Medicine podcast with myself, Owen Walker. In this session, we're going to be speaking with Dan Stretch on the challenges of casevac from Nepal and Pakistan. So Dan works as the operations manager at Global Rescue LLC within the APAC region, as to retrieve some of the patients from the region and coordinate some of the most challenging casevacs in the world. So the region Dan operates in includes the Himalayas in Nepal and K2 in Pakistan. And these mountain ranges are collectively some of the deadliest in the world, and also have posed some of the most difficult retrievals that any air ambulance could face. So also within the span of this year, there's been a fourfold increase in passes to climb in these regions, and something we're going to tap into further in the interview. So welcome to the podcast, Dan. Could you just give a little bit of a potted bio as to how you came to be where you are now, and indeed your role at Global Rescue?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, it's pretty obvious that one of the main factors is the altitude. I mean, I'll just start off with Nepal. It's when you fly into Nepal, you land in Kathmandu. Now, when you land, you're at 1,400 meters. So you land in a city that's, it's not going to cause any symptoms, but just to give you an idea of the terrain there. And then from your hotel window, you'll see, the Himalayan range. So everybody goes to Nepal for that reason, to go climb, go remote. So as soon as you start your trip there, within a day, you're generally, up at 2,000-3,000 meters, and it just gets higher and higher from there. So Everest is 8,800 meters and some change. And, obviously when you go to these remote high altitude locations, a minor medical complaint can quickly get a lot worse. You don't have access to healthcare there. Nepal, there are multiple helicopter companies now. So there are multiple ways of getting to you and getting you back down to healthcare, but obviously they're constrained by things like the weather. They can only fly so high. 7,000 meters is their maximum ceiling they can pick you up at, and even on some mountains can be a little bit lower than that if there's no appropriate place to land. So yeah, it's a tough environment to operate in. I mean, we've, Global Rescue have sort of almost cornered the market for, climbers. We're very popular with them, so we do get a lot of exposure there. Over the years, we've become pretty skilled there, so I don't see Nepal anymore as, the hardest environment to operate in. I'd say Pakistan is another level up. There's less helicopter companies. We just use the Pakistan military there. You're far more remote when you start climbing in Pakistan. You may be like a 7 to 10 day walk to even get to your climb. And the medical facilities in Pakistan are just a level down from what's available in Nepal.
So that sounds challenging on multiple levels, actually, Dan. And looking at, not only the remoteness, but the ceilings of care that you're actually retrieving back to. Could you maybe just speak to your contingency planning, and what contingencies you put in place when you are operating in the Himalayan range, or indeed in Pakistan if Plan A doesn't work?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, Plan A in both regions is generally always going to be a helicopter ride out. There's, even if you're in Everest Base Camp, to get somebody out by ground is going to take a couple of days. Pakistan, you're talking at least a week to get somebody out by ground. So plan A is always a helicopter ride. But as I mentioned previously, these things fail for whatever reason. In Pakistan, it might be that there isn't a helicopter available. It's, we run them through the Pakistan military. Obviously, they have other tasks. Sometimes they're not going to be available. And then in Everest, quite often we're impacted by things like weather, or you might not be in a region that's even, reachable by a helicopter. So in those cases, it's going to be, bringing out somebody by ground, which is challenging. I mean, most of the time we would use the climbers. Hopefully they're with a team of Sherpas who are, skilled at getting people out by ground. They're normally another level of physical fitness above most climbers, so they're able to at least bring people down in altitude. Quite often just bringing people down can, dramatically improve their symptoms if we're talking about altitude related illnesses, or in some cases they can get them to an area where the weather isn't as bad for us to get the helicopter in.
So looking at that, actually, that ground versus air retrieval, and just some of the sort of nuances really around the information you can get, because like you said, I guess it's a lot more protracted when it's a ground retrieval versus an air retrieval. Do you have to sort of build in contingency to almost not expect but predict that maybe the patient might get better, there might be a very different level of recovery, and or picture once that protracted ground retrieval has occurred? Because like you said, the altitude and de-escalating sort of the altitude over time might improve the picture, versus actually retrieval by air, they might still be quite sick. Do you have to be very flexible in your approach when it is a ground retrieval?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we generally nowadays with satellite phones, and actually within Nepal, you generally have a good data signal most of the route all up to Everest Base Camp. There's Wi-Fi that sometimes works at Everest Base Camp. So, if we're doing something like a ground extraction, then we would keep in touch with the person all the way down, and we would then change our decision making process if we're going to launch the helicopter. You find with an awful lot of these cases that as soon as they go down a few hundred meters, they do feel better. The problem is a lot of the time people get themselves into a position where it's difficult for them to even get themselves down a couple hundred meters. But when it's the only thing that they can do and they're able to, yeah, I'd say a good percentage don't then actually need to be evacuated. So you can, save someone's trip sometimes by not immediately launching a helicopter. So, I think it's like anything. We Global Rescue as a company handles hundreds of cases every year. I think this year we handled around 200 cases. So it's the same as when you're sat in an ambulance dispatch room. When you're listening in on the call, after some time, the staff, the company becomes skilled at recognizing the ones that need to be evacuated straight away, are very sick, versus the ones that maybe will improve, on descent. So we look at various things when we're, building this assessment. One thing that is really useful is, the altitude profile. So, how fast somebody has got up to Everest Base Camp, for example, will tell you a lot. You can generally only, the human body can only go up a couple of hundred, up to 400 meters per day, and acclimatize. If somebody's gone from Lukla, which is about 2,400 meters, and then, 4 days later, they're at Everest Base Camp, which is, 5,800 meters, it doesn't take complex maths to work out that they've gone well above what they should have done in terms of their ascent profile. And then the other real red flags we're looking for are signs of HAPE, so high altitude pulmonary edema, and HACE, which is high altitude cerebral edema. If they've got signs and symptoms of either of those conditions, we're going to look to evacuate them straight away. Or conditions like frostbite that really need advanced treatment, we're going to evacuate you straight away. The moderate AMS cases is the ones where there's more detailed decision making to decide whether A, you need to be evacuated, B, the urgency, and C, by what means. With Nepal being so busy, what we've done over the last season and the last several seasons is literally use a helicopter and pick up 5 people. So we'll assess somebody and think, okay, this person does need to be evacuated. They can't easily extract themselves by ground, but they don't have to be evacuated within the next hour. It's reasonable that we can do this, within the next 12 hours. And then on these busy days during Nepal high season, we'd maybe fill 3 helicopters, so maybe up to 15 people in a day. So what that would look like is somebody would call in from Everest Base Camp. We would detail their symptoms, classify it that they would need to be evacuated, but not immediately. And then once we had, we might bring them down to Lukla, put them at Lukla Hospital. We'd have staff, Global Rescue staff there. If they're fine to wait, we would, go and pick up more people. And then once we have a full helicopter, fly them all back to Kathmandu. It's a little bit different in Pakistan. We're only able to fly one person out at a time. So in Pakistan, really, we need to assess, does the person need evacuating versus, can they remain in place or get out by ground? It's a lot more challenging in Pakistan. As I mentioned earlier, it's, when you were talking about the Khumbu region in Nepal, so Everest and down to Lukla, there's lots of little villages. During the climbing season, there's various, medical outposts in places like Fariche, Namche. So you're never too far away from, basic medical care. Whereas in Pakistan, the K2 region, you are really remote. You're a 7 or 8 day walk from civilization. So though in Pakistan, we just have to decide whether you need evacuating or not, and then bring them down to Skardu.
So that sounds like far much more of a linear cut-off in a way. Like you said, you just need to take a finite decision rather than be able to sit on that decision.
Yeah, we do. I mean, we still may not make the decision straight away, because I'll give you an example. In Nepal, the rescue industry there is a commercial enterprise. It's a big money enterprise. There's 5 or 6 helicopter companies that are fighting for business. So it's on a morning. If you had a dispatch screen of all the helicopters, so you could look at the air traffic control as your dispatch screen, you might have more resources than you would in central London on a morning in the NHS ambulance service. You might have 30 resources that are at your disposal to send to somebody. Whereas in Pakistan, you have one resource, which is the Pakistan military. It's a lot more complex. It's a lot more expensive. They don't fly in a single helicopter. Any mission the Pakistan military do, over a mountain range, their protocol is to fly 2 helicopters in. So one person getting picked up gets 2 helicopters. It's a lot further. Skardu to K2, will take several hours in a helicopter and then several hours back. So there's big differences. When you talk about the Himalayas, there's big differences between Nepal and Pakistan. Like I sort of touched on earlier, Nepal is fairly easy now, just because of the numbers of people that climb there and the fact that there's a commercial industry focused on transporting people. The hardest thing in Nepal is just that decision making process on who needs to be evacuated and who doesn't.
So Dan, looking at the training that you provide for the regions, for the retrieval practitioners going in, could you maybe speak to what elements of training you give them when they're out on the roll?
Yeah, sure. So, in Nepal, and we don't deploy people to Pakistan, so I can't really comment on that. But in Nepal, every year we deploy 4, 5, 6 global rescue specialists go to Nepal. They spend a couple of months there. Their main role is to help coordinate the missions and assist people when they're in hospital in Kathmandu. Now they do fly on helicopter missions, but those, in terms of medical training, those are really grab and go missions. You will pick somebody up, they're at Everest Base Camp. They're wearing, a full climbing suit. You don't really have access to, arms and legs, and they're suffering with altitude sickness, where the main treatment you want to give them is to fly them down, to send them down. So we really just grab and go with people, pick them up. There's very limited time and limited space to treat them in the helicopter. So our global rescue staff, they do fly in the helicopters, but generally that is just an additional duty. Their main role there is to be in Kathmandu, and we also place one at Lukla, which is like the gateway to the Khumbu region, and they'll help triage people as they come into Lukla Hospital. The main training that I would do before people go is, it's really focused on, the health and safety of working in helicopters in Nepal. It's a third world country, a developing country. You know this from your travels, that health and safety in some countries is not, a focus. So the first thing that I want to highlight to people that are traveling there, to work for Global Rescue and work on helicopters is, the things they need to do to keep themselves safe. It was, the first time I went was really eye-opening. I mean, I'll give you an example. When you flew into the old helipad in Lukla, you would land the helicopter, or the pilot would land the helicopter, and there's just throngs of locals, tourists, all just hanging out at the helipad. You might have 100 people there, gas canisters, kids, helicopters, starting, and flying off places. So that's the main focus. And then the secondary focus is just on the assessment skills, and I'm talking remote assessment. So how do we assess people over the telephone, over text? How do we determine which ones need to be evacuated? The actual medical side of things is limited there, just because we literally grab people and bring them down. If we do get a complex medical case, quite often we'll engage. We have a team in one of the local hospitals in Kathmandu, and we'll fly the helicopter there, pick them up, and fly them up to the region and bring them down. But that takes hours, right? So it's quite often the best thing to do is to, just literally get people on the helicopter and bring them to medical care instead of taking medical care to them.
So Dan, that all sounds really quite sensible, and probably just the expediting that definitive care elsewhere where there's far more stability sounds sensible. So just speak to that, Dan. Could you speak to maybe the instability of and the dynamic nature of the weather? How much does that play into your sort of decision making skills, your deferral to Plan B or Plan C in the whole plan?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are weather forecasts in that region, but I'm sure if you measured the accuracy of the forecasts, I mean, you can get high-level forecasts that climbers use to decide when to climb, but even those are, just a rough guide. So we defer to the pilots really to give us a good assessment of the weather. Is it safe to fly somewhere? Is it safe to pick someone up? But even with that, they still regularly get stuck places. So I guess one thing is if there's any questionable bad weather, if the pilot reports any questionable bad weather, now bad weather in that region can just be, heavy cloud because they fly, visual flight rules. It means that if we have a borderline case, a case where they may benefit from being in a helicopter, but they potentially can, wait longer, we're really going to reserve the helicopter for the most serious cases then. But it's very unpredictable. I'll give an example of the first time I was there, the first time I flew up to Everest Base Camp. The weather was great, it was beautiful. We flew up, landed at Everest Base Camp. We picked up several climbers there that were sick, and then the pilot was going to fly up to Camp 2 to pick another person up, bring them down to Everest Base Camp, and then collect us all. And they flew up to Camp 2. It was clear skies, and then within 10 minutes, cloud comes in. The pilot luckily managed to make it back down to base camp, which was touch and go for him because he can't afford to just stay at Camp 2. He's got fuel levels. He's got he's not acclimatized to that altitude. He's got limited oxygen, things like that. Manages luckily to make it down to base camp, and then we had a really hairy fly back down to Lukla, literally in the riverbed all the way down. We actually had to stop halfway, and just land the helicopter and wait for this cloud cover to go. That was eye-opening. How fast things change there. So it's, just to conclude, it's unpredictable. We have days, we had, 3-day period this season where all the helicopters were just downed in various locations. So we use the helicopters with that caution in mind, especially when any of the global rescue people are flying on them. If there's any potential to get stuck somewhere, we really don't want them flying on those missions. The helicopter pilots are, somewhat acclimatized. They have survival gear with them. They can generally find somewhere to sleep the night. Our guys aren't acclimatized. They might be acclimatized to Lukla, so just under 3,000 meters. And we do carry, oxygen that they can use when they fly up, but we're not really prepared to spend extended time, at the altitudes that the helicopter might fly up to, like 6,000 meters, 7,000 meters.
So that sounds like a tricky situation. Like you said, not only have you got dynamic weather conditions, you've got dynamic pathology. So you've got, conditions and or illnesses changing. You've got weather conditions changing, sort of windows or opportunities changing all the time. So it's certainly not a sort of a fixed plan, so to speak. But Dan, could you maybe then speak to your notion towards the common pathologies you're seeing on the mountain being that of altitude sickness primarily, maybe hypothermia as well. Could you maybe speak to some of the other pathologies you see? Are you seeing a lot of fractures? Are you seeing a lot of sort of underlying comorbidities that present due to the altitude or due to strenuous exercise?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the main things we see there, the main things we evacuate people for are altitude related. The two ones I mentioned earlier, HAPE and HACE, they're I would say they probably take up 70 to 80% of the evacuations would be those cases. And then we have a lot of people with frostbite. So probably I'd say 10 to 20% would be the average each season, people that are suffering from frostbite. And then the remaining 10% can just be a wide range of things. I mean, just sometimes complete exhaustion. You know, if you've pushed too hard to try and summit Everest, for example, just trying to get back down, people are just completely exhausted to the point, where it does become a medical emergency for them. And then we have a lot of people that have, your normal virus that if they were at sea level or at home wouldn't affect them. I mean, most people climbing there are generally fit individuals, but when they've spent, a month at altitude, their immune system's down, these things can really knock them out. So yeah, the three we see mainly are HAPE, HACE and frostbite, and they're the ones that we'll really look to evacuate ASAP. They're the ones that we treat the most seriously. We do have other traumatic cases. We have had cases, broken legs. People are climbing mountains, right? So they fall down. But that makes up a small amount of our sort of general cases. I probably think we have 3 or 4 per season out of 150 cases. You see those cases less on Everest because as high as Everest is, it's the highest mountain in the world. It's not a technically demanding mountain. It's surprising when you see it the first time. It's not as impressive as you think, because when you fly into Everest Base Camp, you're already at just under 6,000 meters. So Everest is just under 9,000 meters. So it looks like a 3,000 meter mountain. And most of the way up that is, you go through the ice fall, which is obviously the really dangerous part. But once you're through there, it's not extreme. It's there's large plateaus where people are, just walking, and then there's obviously more severe slopes, but it's generally, just walking. It's not a technical climb. There's other mountains in that region, like Annapurna, Amadablam. You see more cases like on those mountains where people, are actually technical climbing, and they can slip and fall. We've had a few cases where people have fallen down crevices, and obviously injured themselves in that way. But those cases aren't as common as maybe you would think from the outside. We see more. I guess we see more cases like that in Pakistan in K2. It's more of a technical climb. There's far more avalanche risk there, so quite often get people injured by falling rocks and avalanches. But the treatment for all these things is the same. It's get a helicopter to them and get them down to definitive care.
So Dan, looking at the what you were talking about earlier offline around the fourfold increase in passes given to climbers post-COVID. I think we're seeing this in the UK in a minor sense. The hiatus in travel, then a real exponential rise in travel post-COVID, and I guess an exponential rise in climbing post-COVID in your region. Could you maybe speak to what that also entails and what risks and or second or third order effects that has brought about?
Yeah, so I mean, everyone lost a couple of years of travel, didn't they? While the pandemic was here, so we saw 2 seasons in Nepal where the first one we had a couple of cases, and then the second season of during the pandemic there was 0 cases because nobody could nobody could even go to Nepal, and then 2021 in Nepal we saw record permit numbers, so record people going there to climb. Was a combination, I guess, of people that hadn't been able to go the previous years that had permits for then. They just moved them to the following years. And then people just looking for any opportunity to travel. So we're now seeing that fall over to Pakistan. So normally Pakistan has been really low numbers, so K2 a busy climbing season. 2019 the last sort of busy climbing season was, I think it was like 50 permits, and then this year you've got several hundred permits, so we're seeing a much larger increase in numbers in both locations. Nepal, it's manageable. You have, like I mentioned earlier, you've got multiple helicopter companies. It's a big industry there. And with a good climbing team, a good expedition team, if you're a fit individual and you really prepare for Everest, it's within most people's capabilities. The hardest thing about climbing Everest, now I speak not from experience here, but from what people have told me, the hardest thing is acclimatizing your body. If you're acclimatized, and nowadays people just really have loads of oxygen that brings the altitude down, you are walking up Everest. So I'm not saying it's easy, but it's within the capabilities of a fit individual. The real worry is that now you're seeing large numbers in Pakistan where it's not quite the same environment. K2 is nicknamed the Killer Mountain, and I think for every person that summits, it's got a 25% fatality rate. So every 4 people that summit, 1 person dies. And it used to be the real, sort of elite climbers that would go there. So you'd only see people there that had already climbed multiple 8,000 meter mountains, very experienced. Most of them weren't doing it as a hobby. It would be, they'd be professional climbers, or very advanced climbers. Whereas now this season, you're still seeing that group set there, but with the accompaniment of a lot of people that haven't got the experience to be in Pakistan. They haven't got the climbing experience. They haven't got the sort of resiliency you'd need to climb in those environments. So it hasn't happened yet. We've seen far more cases than we have previous seasons. We haven't had a complete, can't think what the word is, we haven't had we haven't been overwhelmed yet, but with the 4-fold increase, that's always a possibility. It's always a fear, right? When you've only got one way of getting people out, is seeing 400 people on K2. When you add in all the support staff, all the local porters that will be there, all the guides, the Sherpas that come over from Nepal to help people climb, it's almost, I don't want to tempt fate, but it's almost like a disaster waiting to happen. You think back to I think it was 2017 in Nepal when there was an earthquake there during climbing season. Can't remember if it's 2017 or 2018. You have 100 people all needing rescue at one time. Now, obviously very difficult, with it being a humanitarian disaster zone at the same time, but you have 30 helicopters to go and pick up people, whereas the fear is with the numbers you're now seeing in Pakistan and the lack of resources they have there, if you do get an event like an avalanche, an earthquake, or just people going up there unprepared and getting stuck in a queue like you will have seen in the media for Everest. If you see something like that at K2 and you get 20 people all sick and needing evacuating, it's another level of difficulty to actually do that in Pakistan. So I work in the travel industry. Global Rescue is a travel assistance company. You want to encourage people to travel to these places. I mean, I've not been lucky enough to go to Pakistan. I've just seen it, from photos and videos, and I understand why people want to go there. It's beautiful, and it'd be great to, when you've been to Nepal, the idea of getting more remote is certainly attractive, when sometimes Nepal can feel not remote enough. But I would just say to people to go there with caution, and be resilient. Go there with a plan that doesn't involve getting a helicopter to fly you out. Go there with sufficient medical knowledge. Go there with sufficient medical gear to look after yourself. We've seen several groups this year. They're a week away from civilization and they haven't got anything with them. They haven't even got paracetamol with them. So very unprepared. So that would be the key thing I would say is, yes, it's great that people are traveling to these regions, but I would go there with caution. I mean, I think the numbers that they are taking now to K2 is probably irresponsible, but I understand why they're doing it. I mean, it's a big industry in Pakistan. They've had several years where they haven't had numbers going there. So now this is their opportunity to get the industry back on its feet. But as foreign tourists, we need to be responsible and go there and be able to look after ourselves and use the resources like the helicopter for the people that have no alternative, the really sick individuals.
Yeah, very much so. And what I'm getting from you there, Dan, is like you said, the more remote, essentially the more prepared you need to be and have a plan A, plan B, plan C, and also think about things that you may not have had to think about in Nepal. Dan, from a perspective around retrieval as an operations manager, and sort of from my background, knowing how difficult it is sometimes to get continuity of care for specialist centres to accept patients on the back end of a retrieval, and speaking to hospitals and or getting bed space is challenging. How have you navigated that space from an operations manager perspective around sort of continuity of care?
Again, it's a tale of two stories in the Himalayas. So Nepal is generally very easy to get people into hospitals there. Then I wouldn't call any of the hospitals there world class, but they're certainly comparable with Western standards if you go to the better private hospitals. And again, it's an industry there. So with foreign people that have got insurance willing to pay, generally you'll find not only bed space, but fairly specialist treatment there. I mean, we've had people before, needing really specialist stuff, like they've ended up on ECMO, and, very specialist stuff that you wouldn't just get at any hospital within the UK, but it's available in Nepal. Now, Pakistan is almost the polar opposite. So the place that people are taken to in Pakistan from most regions is Skardu. Skardu is a fairly big city, but the medical facilities there are very substandard. Our guys go to a military hospital. It's called the Combined Military Hospital, and I don't want to disparage them and say they don't get good care there, but it's not always what you would expect from Western standards. They have limited resources there. They generally don't have, the diagnostic capabilities, and one of the issues in Skardu is just even getting people out of Skardu is difficult. So your transport is not over there. In Nepal, in Kathmandu, once you're in Kathmandu, you in terms of medical care, you're pretty sorted there. There's good hospitals, and if the hospitals aren't capable, it's easy to fly in an air ambulance. There's an international airport there, can fly in an air ambulance from anywhere, Thailand, Singapore, or even the United States. The air ambulances can fly in there, right, and get you to wherever you want in the world. Skardu, once you're at the combined military hospital, even getting patients out of there is difficult. Trying to think, we did have one case there where somebody had a spinal injury, so they were taken by the military helicopter to the military hospital in Skardu. They were found to have an unstable spinal fracture, obviously needed to be treated outside of that hospital. There was limited what they would do there. But even what would be a fairly simple case in most places was very complex. I mean, there's not even a domestic transport provider that has, a stretcher, a spinal board, things like that. So in that case, we actually had to fly somebody in from, Global Rescue staff member flew in from Asia, flew into Pakistan to help coordinate, and we had to end up taking seats out of a commercial fixed wing and actually purchasing a spinal board in Islamabad, flying it up to there. So again, it's completely different environment depending if you're in Nepal or Pakistan.
So Dan, as we're coming to land on the conversation, could I just maybe get you to speak to take-home messages from anyone that's considering climbing in indeed sort of Nepal or Pakistan? Like you said, it's really interesting getting your perspective because it is a tale of two stories really, and two very subtly, well not even subtly, dramatic different ecosystems of care, of logistics, of support crew, of risk, and I guess fundamentally your role is risk management and coordinating risk. Could I get you to speak to take-home messages from these extreme environments for anyone who's maybe considering to going there?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'd say go prepared. You have to be a high level of fitness to work well at altitude. I mean, go there with a high level of fitness, so really prepare for your trip in advance. Go there prepared to look after yourself, and what I mean by that is if you're going there as a group, make sure that they have some basic medical provisions, are able to, you're able to get access to clean water, good food. Go there make sure you don't go with a cheap provider, go with a responsible provider. The cheap providers are cheap for a reason. You want to go there with a provider that gives you, good local support. Go there with a plan, what you're going to do if things go wrong, and don't let that plan end at, just getting travel insurance. You need to be prepared to be able to get yourself out in most cases. So, you want survival gear, even if you're only planning on spending a short period of time at, if you're doing, for example, the Everest Base Camp trek, your itinerary might only be a night at Everest Base Camp, or it might even be that you go to Everest Base Camp and then leave, but be prepared to stay there for longer. Things happen. Always have a way of communicating outside that environment. So a satellite phone is ideal. There's several, fairly cheap options you can get now. It doesn't mean buying a really expensive satellite phone. There's satellite devices like the InReach, Garmin InReach, the Zoleo, or you can get these newer devices that help you connect your mobile phone. So, it's no good having good insurance if you're not able to get in touch with us. And treat the locals with respect. That's a big one. I mean, in Nepal and Pakistan, these guys have been living there for, as long as anyone's been living anywhere. These guys know how to operate at altitude, and they will quite often, save you when otherwise you would demise. And take it slow. I mean, that's a real big one, is just to take these trips slow. I'd say a large majority of the cases we see, like I mentioned earlier, it's no surprise that people are sick. You have to have a good acclimatization period. It's very easy. I mean, I've done personal trips in Nepal, and up, climbing up to like 6,500, 7,000 meters, and it's very easy to get carried away. And you think you're fit and you can do more in a day, but it quickly catches up with you if you try and push the boundaries. So take it slow and always be prepared to back off. Walk back down a hill that you've walked up and spend more time, acclimatizing. So any trip that I would look at personally, if people are offering to do the trip in 10 days, I want to work out, okay, is that a good enough time to do the trip in terms of acclimatization? And then I'd always add several days on, so that it leaves me some leeway to spend a day's rest somewhere or get stuck somewhere, things like that.
Listen, that's fantastic advice, and just building plenty of contingency into the plan sounds like a good advice to me. Dan, listen, I just want to thank you for the last hour of your time and your perspectives, because they're both insightful and informative. So thank you.
If you've enjoyed this episode of the World Extreme Medicine podcast, please subscribe, like, and share. And if you want to meet lots of other risk-taking, rule-bending, and inspirational people, then you need to be in Edinburgh on the 19th to the 21st of November for this year's conference. Tickets are on sale now. Go to extrememedicineexpo.com to find out more.